Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today we're going on a deep dive into ancient India.
We're focusing on the Mahajanapada period specifically, around 600 to 300 BCE. It's like India's coming of age story.
Okay, so not just like some dusty history, but like stuff that's still relevant today.
Exactly. It laid the groundwork for so much of what we see in India today. We're talking about early states, economic innovations, religious shifts, all the ingredients for a really complex and pluralistic society.
Okay, so paint a picture for me. What was life like back then? Like, what were the major trends?
Imagine a society transitioning from nomadic life to settled agriculture. It was a huge shift, impacted everything. Social structures, spiritual beliefs, the whole nine yards.
So like settling down basically messed with their whole worldview?
Pretty much, and it's all reflected in their texts from the time, like the Vedas. You can see them grappling with the changes, the anxiety, the hope.
Fascinating. So out of all this change emerged the Mahajanapadas.
Right. 16 powerful states vying for dominance across ancient India. But here's the thing, they weren't all the same. Some were republics, others monarchies, a real mix of political structures.
So like a real-life Game of Thrones.
You got it. Constant competition for resources and power. And, that political diversity wasn't just a phase. It actually kind of foreshadows modern India's federal structure, where states have autonomy within a larger union. The seeds were planted way back then.
So those ancient power struggles still have an impact today.
Absolutely. But it wasn't all just about politics. We also see serious economic innovation happening during this era.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up. Our sources point to some pretty big advancements.
Totally. For starters, there's the development of coinage. Revolutionized trade, made transactions smoother. Then you've got specialized crafts flourishing, adding complexity to the economy.
And to top it all off,
Extensive trade routes, connecting different parts of India. And it wasn't just about exchanging goods, it was also about ideas, cultural practices, the whole package.
so like a real cultural melting pot situation.
Exactly. And hold on, because there's even more to it.
Oh,
The Mahajanapada period was also a time of intense religious and philosophical debate. Vedic traditions were still influential, but new movements like Jainism and Buddhism were emerging.
really? So a spiritual revolution on top of everything else.
Yeah, challenging existing norms, offering new paths to spiritual fulfillment. And those movements didn't just stay in India, they spread throughout Asia.
It's amazing how something that happened so long ago can still have such a huge impact today.
Isn't it? But we also need to address the more, shall we say, challenging aspects of this era.
Right, the caste system. I was wondering when we'd get to that.
It's sensitive but crucial when talking about Indian identity. And it's important to remember that while the seeds of the caste system were sown during this period, it wasn't the rigid discriminatory system we see later on. The Vedic ideas of social order did involve a division of labor, but it was way more fluid back then.
So it's more like those early social structures kind of solidified into something much more rigid and problematic later on.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And understanding this evolution helps us grasp the historical roots of the caste system and how Indian society has grappled with it ever since.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got this complex picture emerging, but I'm really curious about the specific legacies of the Mahajanapada period that are still visible in India today. What are some of the most prominent echoes of the past?
Well, one major legacy is India's tradition of religious pluralism. Remember how the Mahajanapadas had Buddhism, Jainism, and Vedic traditions all coexisting? That laid the groundwork for the diverse religious landscape we see today.
That's really striking, especially in a world that often seems so divided along religious lines. What other legacies can we trace back to that time?
Let's go back to those diverse political structures, from republics to monarchies. That historical experience may have influenced the framers of modern India's constitution. When they chose a federal system that balances national unity with state autonomy, they might have been looking back at that period.
So they were drawing on the wisdom of their ancestors. That's fascinating.
It is. And then there are the economic innovations, the development of coinage, specialized crafts, trade routes. These weren't just historical footnotes.
They were the building blocks of India's economy.
Exactly. Even in something as modern as the Indian stock market or those bustling tech hubs, you can see a thread connecting back to the Mahajanapada era.
It's incredible how everything is connected, isn't it? But we can't forget about the less positive legacies, like the early development of the caste system, which, as we discussed, became deeply ingrained in Indian society, causing divisions and discrimination that still persist today.
Absolutely. It's a sobering reminder that history isn't just about triumphs and innovations, it's also about the complexities and challenges that continue to shape our world.
And by confronting those difficult aspects of the past, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped our world. So we've covered a lot of ground: the emergence of the Mahajanapadas, the economic and religious changes, and the origins of the caste system. It's clear this period was crucial for shaping Indian identity. But there's one more element I want to bring in: the British East India Company.
Ah, yes. The company's arrival adds a whole new dimension to this story. It's fascinating how they grappled with the legacy of the Mahajanapadas, trying to understand these complex systems of governance and social structures.
It's like they stumbled upon a civilization that was already incredibly advanced, with centuries of political, economic, and religious sophistication behind it.
And that encounter, that clash of cultures and worldviews, would have a profound impact on the course of Indian history. So, how did the British make sense of this complex, ancient civilization? Did they appreciate its achievements, or were they just focused on exploitation?
It was a bit of both, honestly. They were definitely intrigued by India's history and culture, but they also came in with preconceived notions. Lots of stereotypes about Asiatic despotism and Oriental splendor. They had to reconcile their own beliefs with what they actually found, and that tension would shape their whole approach to colonial rule.
So, they were fascinated, but also kind of judgmental. This is getting interesting.
Oh, it definitely does. But before we dive into all the complexities of British colonialism, let's take a moment to appreciate the achievements of the Mahajanapada period. They really laid the foundation for the vibrant, diverse, and complex India we see today.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the details, but let's take a moment to acknowledge the ingenuity, the resilience, the creativity of those ancient Indians who, in so many ways, shaped the destiny of a subcontinent. I couldn't agree more. The Mahajanapada period really showcases the enduring power of human innovation, and its legacy continues to inspire and challenge us even today.
Okay, so with that inspiring thought in mind, let's move on to the next chapter: the arrival of the British East India Company and the dawn of a new era in Indian history. Buckle up. Things are about to get really interesting.
Indeed, they are. The British East India Company's arrival marks a pivotal turning point, a real clash of cultures and ambitions that would reshape the subcontinent.
Well, I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Mahajanapadas set the stage for Indian identity. Now imagine that world being totally disrupted by the arrival of the British East India Company.
Talk about a culture clash. I can only imagine what it must have been like to have these foreign traders coming in and shaking things up so dramatically.
And it wasn't just about trade either. The company slowly but surely started gaining political power, eventually becoming the main force in India. But get this, Indian responses to this growing British presence were super diverse. There wasn't one unified Indian perspective on what was happening.
Right, of course, that makes sense. It'd be like assuming all Europeans would react the same way to some big event, totally unrealistic.
Exactly. Some Indians saw the British arrival as a chance to collaborate and get ahead. Others were totally against it and resisted, either through open rebellion or more subtle ways of pushing back. And then you had those stuck in the middle, just trying to survive in this new world.
So you have the collaborators, the rebels, and those trying to adapt. Makes sense.
And all of those reactions came from such a mix of motivations. Some wanted to protect their way of life, their cultural identity. Others were drawn to the potential benefits of British rule, like Western education or new economic opportunities. It's important to remember these were real people making tough choices in a world changing super fast.
It's easy to judge from where we are now,
Yeah.
but yeah, put yourself in their shoes. Imagine being some Indian official or landowner back then, seeing your whole world turned upside down by this powerful outsider. What would you do?
That's the question, isn't it? How much control did Indians actually have in the face of this growing colonial power? It's not just some abstract historical debate. These choices had real impact on people's lives, their livelihoods, families, even their sense of self.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing the impact of British policies wasn't the same for everyone. Some must have benefited more than others, right?
You got it. British policies definitely created winners and losers in Indian society, often making existing social divisions even worse. They were masters of divide and rule, pitting different groups against each other to keep their control.
It's such a common tactic, sadly.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about those who actively resisted British rule. What do our sources say about them?
We see evidence of resistance throughout the colonial period. Everything from huge uprisings like the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857 to smaller, more localized acts of defiance.
Oh yeah, the Sepoy Mutiny. That's a story for another deep dive for sure. But what about some of those earlier forms of resistance?
Well, one fascinating example is the Santal Rebellion. Happened around 1855-56. The Santals, an indigenous group in eastern India, basically rose up against British oppression and exploitation.
What were their main grievances?
Well, they were protesting the British legal system. They saw it as totally biased against them. Plus, they were furious about how the British were exploiting their land and resources. British officials, moneylenders, you name it.
So it was about economic hardship, but also a sense of injustice, wanting to protect their culture and autonomy.
Exactly. It was a really complex rebellion. It really shook the British administration, reminded them that their control over India wasn't absolute.
It's like those acts of resistance, even when they didn't succeed, really challenged that whole British narrative of them being benevolent rulers.
Yeah,
For sure.
they exposed the cracks in that colonial facade. But resistance wasn't always these big dramatic events. It could be much more subtle, woven into everyday life.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, think about it. You could have Indian officials working within the British administration. They might subtly sabotage policies, maybe by delaying orders or misinterpreting instructions. Village elders might withhold information, protect their communities from interference, small acts of defiance.
Right. And then there's cultural resistance, the revival of traditional art forms, music, literature, all as a way of asserting Indian identity against British cultural dominance.
Exactly. Cultural resistance wasn't just about keeping traditions alive. It was about saying, you might control our land, but you can't control our hearts and minds.
It's really powerful how even singing a song or telling a story could be a way of resisting.
It speaks to the power of culture. Okay, so we talked about those who rebelled. What about the Indians who chose to collaborate with the British? What were their motivations?
That's a good question. It's easy to judge them, but it's important to understand where they were coming from.
For sure. We have to remember that the British Raj created opportunities as well as challenges. Some Indians saw the potential for advancement through education, government service, or business. For some, it was about pragmatically adapting to a new reality. For others, it was pure ambition, seizing the opportunities this new order presented. And for some, it was a genuine belief that British rule would bring progress and modernization to India.
It's not our place to judge, really.
Okay.
They were making choices within a system they didn't create.
Exactly. There were no easy answers, no clear-cut right or wrong. It was a really morally ambiguous situation, and everyone had to find their own way. But even within this tough environment, Indians weren't just passive. They found ways to act, to shape their destinies.
Like how?
Well, they formed political organizations, published newspapers, engaged in passionate debates about the future of India. It was this intellectual energy, this engagement with ideas that would eventually lay the groundwork for the Indian nationalist movement.
It's amazing how those early forms of resistance, whether through rebellion, subversion, or just plain intellectual engagement, all contributed to India's eventual independence.
It really shows the power of ideas and how important it is to challenge the status quo. It speaks to that basic human desire for freedom.
Okay, so we've gone from the big picture of ancient India to the nitty-gritty of colonial rule. We've seen how different eras are connected, how the past echoes in the present. But what about those who weren't actively collaborating or rebelling? What about the everyday people just trying to live their lives in the midst of all this upheaval?
That's such an important perspective, and it's often overlooked. The vast majority of Indians were probably in this category: farmers, merchants, artisans, priests, ordinary people just trying to get by. They weren't leading revolutions, but their lives were still profoundly affected by what was happening. Their stories are crucial for understanding how colonialism impacted India at the ground level.
It's like trying to understand this huge, complicated tapestry. We see the big patterns, the dramatic scenes, but it's the individual threads, those countless lives and experiences that truly make up the fabric.
Beautifully put. And by focusing on those individual threads, we can really appreciate the human cost of colonialism, the resilience of the Indian people, their capacity for adaptation and survival.
So we've talked about those who collaborated, those who rebelled, and those who just tried to live their lives. But I'm wondering, how did this encounter with British colonialism, with all its ups and downs and contradictions, end up shaping Indian identity in the long run?
That's the million-dollar question. It's like trying to untangle a knot that's been tied for centuries.
But it's not worth untangling, right?
Oh, absolutely. And one way to approach it is to think about nationalism. See, the experience of British colonialism, with all its unfairness and injustice, sparked this feeling of shared grievance among Indians. They realized they had common interests that went beyond religion, language, and region.
So it was the British who, without meaning to, created the conditions for Indian nationalism to emerge.
It's one of those historical paradoxes. Their attempt to control India ultimately led to the very movement that would challenge their rule. But the nationalist movement wasn't just about getting rid of the British, it was also about reclaiming Indian identity, bringing back traditions and values that had been suppressed or distorted during colonial rule.
So it was a fight for freedom and a fight for their culture.
You got it. It was a multifaceted movement. It had political, social, and cultural goals. It was about creating a new India free, independent, and proud of its heritage.
And that vision drew on both ancient traditions and modern ideas, right?
Exactly. India had this ancient civilization with deep philosophical and spiritual roots, but then it had this encounter with Western modernity, with its focus on reason, science, and progress. And out of that clash came this unique, dynamic form of nationalism, one that used both Eastern and Western influences to create a distinctly Indian identity.
So in a way, the British, despite trying to impose their own culture, actually helped create a more unified and self-aware Indian nation.
It's a remarkable outcome. It shows how resilient people can be and how adaptable culture is. But the story doesn't end with Indian independence, does it? The legacies of colonialism, nationalism, and the blending of old and new are still playing out in India today.
That's so true. It's like the past is still very much alive in India.
One way to see that is to think about the ongoing debates about what it actually means to be Indian. There isn't just one definition, is there?
Right. People have different perspectives and interpretations based on religion, language, caste, region, and political beliefs. It's always changing.
You got it. It's a dynamic concept, constantly being negotiated and redefined. It's like the ghosts of the past are still present, shaping debates about everything from social justice to economics to cultural identity.
Okay, so we've talked about this complex interplay of legacies, but let's bring it back to the Mahajanapada period. Can we draw any connections between that ancient era and modern India, beyond the obvious historical links?
That's a great challenge. It's like we're searching for those hidden echoes of the past and the present, those patterns that keep popping up across time.
It's like finding those recurring themes in a symphony, those melodies that come back in different forms. So what are those themes, those echoes of the Mahajanapadas in modern India?
Well, one clear connection is the idea of diversity as a core part of Indian identity. We talked about the political, economic, and religious diversity of the Mahajanapadas. That diversity is still a hallmark of India today.
Right, it's like India's DNA.
Absolutely. India is a land of many languages, religions, cultures, and traditions. It's a mosaic, a tapestry.
And that diversity is often seen as both a strength and a challenge.
Right. Exactly. It's a source of incredible creativity, innovation, but it also leads to friction and conflict. It's like those ancient Mahajanapadas always competing for power and resources, but also coexisting and influencing each other.
Yeah, that push and pull, that mix of unity and diversity feels like a constant in Indian history.
You got it. And it's still shaping India's political, social, and cultural landscape today. It's pretty amazing to think that those patterns were established so long ago, back in the Mahajanapada period. But diversity isn't the only connection. What about those economic innovations we discussed? The coinage, the specialized crafts, the trade routes. Those laid the groundwork for India's economic development over centuries.
Those were huge achievements for their time.
They were. And you can see the echoes of those early achievements in India's modern economy, in its entrepreneurial spirit, its growing role as a global economic power.
So even in something as modern as the tech industry in Bangalore, there's a connection back to those ancient traders and artisans.
Absolutely. It shows the long-term impact of those early economic foundations. It's like those ancient innovations planted a seed that keeps growing in unexpected ways. Okay, so we've got diversity and economic innovation as key connections between the Mahajanapadas and modern India. Anything else?
What about the religious landscape? The Mahajanapada period saw those new religious movements like Jainism and Buddhism emerge, right, alongside the Vedic traditions.
Right. It was a time of huge religious and philosophical change. It's fascinating how those new movements challenged the existing order and offered new spiritual paths.
And they're still around today.
Exactly. Jainism and Buddhism are still thriving in India alongside Hinduism and other faiths. So the religious pluralism we see in India today goes way back.
It's a reminder that religious diversity isn't new in India. It's woven into the fabric of the country's history. Okay, so we've identified these key connections: diversity, economic innovation, and religious pluralism. But before we wrap up, I have one last question. We've talked about how the past shapes the present, but how can understanding the past actually help us deal with the future?
That's a great question. It's like asking, what's the point of studying history? Why bother with all these old stories if they don't have any relevance to our lives today?
Right, so why is it important?
Well, for one thing, understanding the past helps us understand the present. By looking at the roots of current events, ideas, and institutions, we get a much deeper appreciation for the forces that have shaped our world.
So it's about context. It's about seeing the present as part of this long, complex historical process.
Exactly. And that context can help us make better decisions about the future.
Okay, I get the context idea, but can you give me a real-world example? Like, how can knowing history actually help solve problems today?
Well, think about some of the challenges facing India right now, like poverty, inequality, and environmental damage. These are complex problems with deep roots in the past. By understanding those historical factors, we can come up with more effective and lasting solutions.
So it's not just about dwelling on the past, it's about using it to inform our present and create a better future.
Exactly. That's the real value of history.
So as we wrap up this exploration of the Mahajanapada period and its legacies, I think the takeaway is that the past isn't just something that's over and done with. It's still shaping our world today.
I couldn't agree more. And by understanding the past, we gain valuable insights into the present and empower ourselves to create a better future.
And now let's shift gears and talk about the British East India Company.
Ah, yes, the company. Their arrival in India was a turning point, a clash of cultures and ambitions that would leave a permanent mark on the subcontinent.
It's hard to grasp the scale of their impact. How did this group of traders end up changing the entire political and social landscape of India?
It's a story full of ambition, conflict, and unintended consequences. To really get it, we need to look at the company's complicated relationship with the Mughal Empire. They were the dominant power in India before the company rose to prominence.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was the state of the Mughal Empire when the British East India Company showed up?
This was the 18th century. The Mughal Empire wasn't the powerhouse it once was. It was in a period of decline, starting to break apart.
So the British arrived when the Mughals were vulnerable. Did they see it as a chance to take over?
It's a bit more complicated than that. The British were fascinated by the Mughals, their wealth, their grandeur, their system of government. But they also had these preconceived notions. Lots of stereotypes about Oriental despotism, you know.
Oh yeah, that idea of Asian rulers being these all-powerful, absolute monarchs, a big part of how Europeans saw the world back then.
Exactly. And this clashed with their own ideas about limited government and individual liberties. But here's the interesting part. While the British might have seen the Mughal emperors as absolute rulers, they also recognized that the Mughal Empire had a long and complex history. Centuries of traditions and laws.
So they were intrigued by the Mughals, but also a bit suspicious of their power. How did they reconcile those two things?
They came up with this concept of an ancient Mughal constitution. It was like they were trying to find some historical justification for being in India, trying to make their actions seem like something more than just grabbing power.
So they were like, we're not here to destroy your traditions, we're here to save them. Under our guidance, of course.
Exactly. They wanted to be seen as the saviors of India, rescuing it from chaos and decline.
Hold on. If they saw the Mughal emperors as these all-powerful despots, how could they also believe in this idea of an ancient constitution? It seems like they contradict each other.
It's all in how you interpret things. The British focused on the parts of Mughal history that supported their idea of being benevolent interveners, and they downplayed or ignored the parts that didn't fit.
So they cherry-picked the evidence to fit their own agenda.
You got it. They were building a narrative that worked for them, even if it meant twisting or oversimplifying complex aspects of Mughal history and culture.
Sounds like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Admiring the Mughals while using their supposed weaknesses to justify British rule. Did this ancient Mughal constitution idea actually influence British policies?
It did. It shaped how they dealt with things like land ownership, the legal system, and even how justice was administered. For example, they initially tried to keep the Mughal system of collecting taxes, but they also introduced their own reforms, which of course sometimes had unintended consequences.
So it wasn't just a PR stunt. They tried to integrate Mughal traditions into their administration, at least to some degree. But I'm guessing as their power grew, they cared less and less about upholding this ancient constitution.
You're right on the money. As the British gained more control, they became more assertive. They wanted to reshape India according to their vision. They started introducing Western education, reforming the legal system along British lines, and replacing Persian with English as the language of administration.
So it was a gradual shift from accommodation to assimilation, from trying to fit in to actively changing India to fit their ideals.
Precisely. And this shift was happening all over the colonial world at the time. You often see this pattern where the colonizers start by exploring and adapting, and then they transition to a more assertive, transformative phase as they get more confident in their power and worldview.
It's interesting how those early attempts to justify British rule by appealing to Mughal traditions eventually gave way to this more assertive approach. It's like they went through their own evolution, from hesitant newcomers to confident rulers.
That's a great point. It shows just how dynamic colonialism is, how it changes and adapts to new situations and power dynamics. But it also brings up important questions about the long-term effects of this colonial encounter, how it shaped not just the politics and economics of India, but also its cultural identity and its place in the world.
So we've established that the British East India Company showed up during Mughal decline. They were intrigued by, but also wary of Mughal power, and they used Mughal traditions selectively to justify their own rule. But this is just the beginning of the story, right? What happened next? How did a trading company become a full-blown colonial power?
That's a question that takes us right into the heart of the British Raj, a time of huge transformation and upheaval that would change the destiny of India. It's a story full of ambition, conflict, and the clash of cultures and ideas.
Sounds fascinating. Let's dive into the story of the British Raj and its lasting impact on India. All right, so we left off with the British East India Company trying to solidify their position in a rapidly changing India, navigating Mughal decline, selectively adopting traditions, but also with an eye on expansion. How did they go from a trading company to a full-blown colonial power? What were some of their key strategies?
Well, one key factor was their military power and their knack for forming alliances. They weren't just merchants, they had their own army, and they weren't afraid to use it.
There was a mix of playing the trade game and the war game.
Exactly. They took advantage of rivalries that already existed between Indian rulers, forged alliances, played different factions against each other, classic divide and conquer, and that let them slowly expand their territory and influence.
Sadly, that's a tactic that's been used time and time again throughout history. But military might wasn't their only tool, right? They also needed to figure out how to actually govern this massive, complex territory.
Right, and that's where their administrative skills came in. They realized they couldn't just force a completely foreign system of government onto India. They had to adapt, at least to some degree.
So it was a learning process, figuring out how to make their rule work for the local population.
Exactly. They studied how the Mughals ran things, adopted parts of their revenue collection system, even kept using Persian as the administrative language, at least in the beginning. They knew that to gain acceptance, especially early on, they had to work within the existing structures.
It's fascinating how they were able to incorporate elements of the very system they were aiming to dismantle. But I'm guessing this adaptation phase didn't last forever, did it?
You're right. As the company's power grew, they became more assertive about imposing their own vision for India. They started introducing Western education, reforming the legal system along British lines, and gradually replacing Persian with English as the language of administration.
So it was a slow but deliberate process of reshaping India's institutions according to British ideals.
Exactly. And this process often faced pushback from Indian elites and officials who saw their own power slipping away.
Well, yeah, it makes sense that they would resist. They were watching their world being dismantled and a new order being imposed that often benefited the British at their expense.
Exactly. And this resistance took many forms, from small acts of defiance to full-blown rebellions.
Right, like the Santal Rebellion we talked about earlier. And then there was the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. These events were huge blows to British rule. They showed that British power wasn't absolute.
Definitely. These acts of resistance, big or small, forced the British to rethink their strategies. They had to acknowledge the deep resentment their policies were creating.
But despite these challenges, the British did manage to establish a vast and powerful empire in India. What were some of the long-term consequences of British rule? How did it change India?
Well, the legacy of British rule is complicated. There are many sides to it. On the one hand, they brought in innovations in infrastructure, technology, and education, things that had a lasting impact. But on the other hand, their policies often led to economic exploitation, social upheaval, and the weakening of traditional institutions.
It's a mixed bag then. Progress and exploitation, modernization and disruption. It's hard to weigh those things against each other and make a simple judgment.
You're absolutely right. It's not about making simplistic judgments. It's about recognizing the complexity of history, seeing both the positive and negative consequences of colonialism, and acknowledging that people had very different experiences under British rule.
That's a great point. History isn't black and white. It's full of nuances, and we need to grapple with those complexities to understand the past and how it continues to shape the present.
Couldn't agree more. As we wrap up this journey through Indian history, from the Mahajanapadas to the British Raj, it's important to remember that the story doesn't end there. India became independent in 1947, but the legacies of colonialism, nationalism, and the interplay of ancient and modern ideas are still shaping India today.
That's a great point. History isn't just something that happened long ago. It's a living force that's still shaping our world in countless ways. And as we finish up this deep dive, I think we can all agree that India's history is more than just a collection of facts and dates. It's a vibrant, complex story that's still unfolding.
Perfectly said. And with that, we encourage you to keep exploring the amazing world of Indian history. There's always more to learn, more to uncover, and more to connect with our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed the journey. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of history and ideas. See you then.